To get to the NBA playoffs, you can hear Celtics versus Heat tonight on 97.3 ESPN. Coverage begins at 7:30. You also heard the Lakers manhandle the Nuggets last night. So get into that and more is Bryan Toporek. Of course, you can follow him on Twitter at @BToporek. He's the co-host of the NBA podcast. Also, he does work with Bleacher Report and Forbes Sports. So he joins us now on the Boardwalk kind of hotline here on Sports Bash Saturday on 97.3 ESPN. Bryan, how you doing this Saturday?
I'm doing well, Josh. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I got to start with that Lakers-Nuggets game before we get to anything else. Listen, I thought the Nuggets would at least play it close, but it became more and more obvious as that game went along. The Lakers have the better athletes, and as soon as they couldn't get any other production outside of Jokic and Murray, and as soon as Jokic got in that foul trouble, the Lakers just took away the game and the hopes and the dreams in game one from the Nuggets. It was nuts.
Yeah, well, the Nuggets have the Lakers right where they want them because now they're down. I mean, they need to get down 3-1, and then we'll start talking.
Is that the key?
I think so. I mean, it really might be, given how the first two rounds have gone. But no, I mean, obviously not the start to the series that the Nuggets would have hoped for. I think, the foul trouble in general, yeah, I think the Lakers had like 32 free throws in the first half or something like that. Hopefully going to be an outlier in the series. I know a lot of people on Nuggets Twitter in particular were not thrilled about the officiating last night. So, I mean, it was definitely a wake-up call. I think the Lakers in transition especially were fantastic. Defensively, they were great. They had a good answer for the Murray-Jokic combination in particular. So, there's a lot for the Nuggets to work on, and of course, not much time for them to do it. But they'll have a lot of tape to go over today and try to figure out a better game plan ahead of game two.
Do you think that the Lakers have the Jokic answer because they can rotate so many big men at him?
Yeah, I mean it's a not great matchup for the Nuggets just because when Montrezl Harrell was on the floor in that Clippers-Nuggets series, he was not nearly as good as he was during the regular season. But as you said, the Lakers not only have Anthony Davis, but they also have Dwight Howard, JaVale McGee. Dwight Howard played pretty well last night, I thought. So they have the option where they can change who's guarding Jokic. It's not just, the Clippers had Zubac and that was basically it. The Nuggets can throw one of their traditional centers on him, but they can also put Anthony Davis on him, and that allows them to get a little more creative in terms of their switches on pick and rolls. So, the size advantage that the Nuggets had and exploited over the Clippers is not there against the Lakers. Jamal Murray, I thought, had a pretty good game, 21 points on 7 of 12 shooting. They're going to need him to have a huge series, I think, to have any chance in this one. If I'm the Nuggets, I'm not too discouraged by one game. Again, I think the foul trouble will hopefully be somewhat of an outlier here. But I think the big keys for them is to figure out some way to get that Jokic-Murray game unlocked a little bit more, and then also just be a lot more alive in transition. Like, expect the Lakers to run out whenever they can.
Of course, that was the game last night here on 97.3 ESPN. Tonight we have Game 3 of Celtics versus Heat. Coverage begins at 7:30, and I know I'm as shocked as anybody that the Heat are up 2-0 in the series, but at the same time, it feels like we shouldn't be surprised, Bryan, because of the fact that this Heat team seems to be playing better as a unit, as a team, as a group than any other team in these playoffs. And for Boston to be as confused as they were against the zone, I mean, it's a zone. Like you've seen that since you were seventh grade of middle school into now. It's like the fact that is puzzling them so much tells me that listen, Spoelstra just seems to be out coaching everybody, and the players are buying in.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're kind of all moving on a string defensively, which is what you would like to see from a team, especially this deep in the playoffs. And you're not used to seeing a Brad Stevens coached team fall apart execution-wise, especially late in games. It's usually the opposite, especially if you're watching a Celtics-Sixers series. So it's kind of surreal. It speaks to how good of a coach that Eric Spoelstra is in general and how well he is coached his guys in this series. I think part of it, the Heat really didn't. I think I saw this. I forget who tweeted this out, but it was, the first 2 rounds of the playoffs, they didn't play a single possession of zone. Then game 1, they played some. Game 2, they played a ton. So it was something that the Celtics had to know was coming, because the Heat during the regular season broke it out at times, and the Raptors broke it out against them and had some success. So it's not like they were caught completely off guard, but now they know, okay, these guys are actually going to run it. We got to figure something out. And to their credit, they started to later in the game. They had Marcus Smart at the nail, Jaylen Brown on the baseline, and they got their offense moving a little bit more. So I don't think it's something that the Heat will start their base defense in zone in game 3 and the Celtics will have no answers. But I'm sure they spent a lot of practice yesterday going over, okay, when you start seeing these looks, what do we do?
I know there's conjecture that Gordon Hayward may be back for this game or the next game. What kind of difference would he actually make for Boston?
Yeah, I mean, it's just one more primary offensive option that they can have. I mean, Boston without him is a pretty top-heavy team. And, those 3 or 4 guys, Kemba, Jaylen, Tatum, and Marcus Smart are all really good. That's not to take away from anything, but I think Miami is the deeper team right now. So getting Hayward back, I don't think he's going to come back and play 35 minutes a night right away. And I don't think he should even move back into the starting lineup. I think what they have there with Marcus Smart defensively is too valuable to bench him for a guy who's, got a month's worth of rust coming off of an injury. So I think Hayward's probably looking at, 20, 25 minutes off the bench, but that's going to give them another guy who they can actually rely on to score. And, these games have been close. It's not like Miami has blown them out in either game. Like, Boston had a pretty commanding lead for a lot of game 2 before they fell apart late. So, if you're Boston and you can have that 8-point, 10-point, 11-point lead, and then Hayward comes in and you can rely on him when some of your, when Kemba, Tatum, Brown are all resting, that can help you stretch the lead rather than give it back. So I don't think he is the number one reason they would win this series if he does come back in game 3 or game 4, but he's certainly going to help.
Bryan Toporek joining me here on the Boardwalk on the hotline on 97.3 ESPN, co-host of the NBA podcast, quality editor for Bleacher Report, NBA contributor for Forbes Sports. Follow him on Twitter at @BToporek. Bryan, let's get to the situation that is the 76ers head coach opening. And I'm calling it, as I said, a situation earlier for those who heard me, because of the fact that I have no idea what's going on. And we have credible people like Adrian Wojnarowski and Shams Charania and Keith Pompey, who covers the Sixers, credible people reporting that Mike D'Antoni is a legitimate candidate. And I don't understand in what galaxy Mike D'Antoni worked with a Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid team. Meanwhile, I understand Ty Lue, I understand Jason Kidd, I understand these other coaches, but Mike D'Antoni blatantly runs a certain style of basketball, and it feels like it's literally, hey, you were already here, why don't you come back? I don't understand this, Bryan.
I don't either. I mean, I'll say this, ESPN's Dave Jacoby came up with the conspiracy theory Thursday of like, well, if they're really considering Mike D'Antoni, what does that mean for Joel Embiid moving forward? It probably means they're not married to him as long as, Ellen Brand came out and said he's not planning on trading Ben or Joel this offseason. Well, if you're bringing in Mike D'Antoni, then, that this offseason, sure. What about next offseason? So I think that is, fair to question. I will say, I mean, D'Antoni, during his time with the Suns, was, fast-paced, 7 seconds or less, shoot a ton of threes. Houston, still shoot a ton of threes, but relied more on isolation because he had James Harden, who he called the best ISO player in the world. So he has showed some ability to adapt his coaching style based on the personnel, which I think would make him somewhat interesting for the Sixers. But I agree, it's, he's never coached a big man post-up threat like Joel Embiid, so it would be a radical departure from him. Now, I think, would it be helpful to get his strategy of run with tempo and fire up more threes than you have? But yes, because the Sixers have decreased in their share of three-pointers in terms of their where they rank league-wide in terms of three-pointers each of the past 4 years. They were in the top 10 a few years ago. I think they were 22nd this year. So that is not great. I mean, a lot of that is personnel, but, I mean, a lot of the Rockets players did not shoot very well from three this year. Eric Gordon, Robert Covington were extremely streaky, but they still let fire 7-8 times a game. Like, that's what the Sixers need from guys like Tobias Harris and Josh Richardson, even if they're not shooting at a great percentage. So I think that would make him interesting. But, I arrived at the same conclusion as you did. It's like, if they're actually going after D'Antoni, what does that mean for Joel Embiid moving forward? And I don't have a good answer.
You mentioned the three-point shooting. Couldn't one argue, though, that part of the reason why they didn't shoot a lot of threes was because they didn't have the right personnel for that? J.J. Redick was gone. There was no guy in the starting lineup that was a legitimate, outside Tobias Harris, a legitimate three-point shooting threat. So couldn't one argue that part of the reason why they weren't shooting threes was because they didn't really have the three-point shooters to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely fair to argue. Harris did shoot above 40% from three during his time with the Clippers. So I think, you would like to see him fire more than he averaged 5 per game this year. And he shot 36.7%, which if you watch the Sixers for most of the year, you might not believe that. But, that's a completely respectable average rate. Josh Richardson was at 34.1%, but, he's shot 37.8 2 years ago. He's 35.7 last year. So, again, not elite, not J.J. Redick for sure, but you just need that spacing threat. A lot of these guys just seem to be in their head a lot throughout the year. I mean, I remember tweeting a clip early in the season where Tobias caught a pass above the break, and there was no one within probably 10 feet of him. And instead of taking the widest open three, he drove and tried to attempt a mid-range shot and turned it over. So, these guys I think a lot of it was trying to feel each other out and trying to maximize, am I getting the best possible shot on this possession? Whereas you saw a guy like Alec Burks come in and he just had no conscience. He just took shots. And that's what they need. They need to be less predictable offensively. And if they can't over pursue a great shot. If you have an open three, take it and don't try to say, okay, but actually we could pass it to Joel Embiid and then he could get in the post and he might have a higher percentage shot. Well, maybe, but you also might turn it over and you have no shot at all.
Let's get back to D'Antoni because I want to know what is the reasoning why he's no longer in Houston? Because I felt like it was just a couple of years ago they almost got to the NBA Finals. A couple of years later they went with this revolutionary small ball, and now all of a sudden he's not there anymore. I know he wasn't fired, but it kind of felt like from the very beginning that even if he didn't leave on his own volition, that Houston was going to move on from him anyway. So what is the deal with Houston and D'Antoni?
Yeah, I mean, Kelly Iko of The Athletic had a great piece about that I would encourage everyone to check out. That kind of gets into the backstory of where everything started to break down. The long story short of it is he wanted a contract extension a couple of years ago, and when Alexander sold the team to Tillman Fertitta, that's kind of where things broke down. And it seemed like basically the entire time Fertitta just would not make D'Antoni feel as wanted as D'Antoni wanted to feel. So, eventually last summer they went to his cabin somewhere and offered him a 1-year extension, but D'Antoni spoke with his agent and said no. So I think a lot of it was some, I don't want to say disagreement necessarily, but I think there was they weren't on the same page between the coach and the owner of the team.
D'Antoni's becoming a bit of a vagabond here between going to the Suns and the Knicks and the Lakers and the Rockets, and now potentially, if you read his press release, him and his wife release, which was a little odd, but okay. Last time I've never seen a basketball coach release a press release with him and his wife before. He was in the professional ranks. It's like a college thing, but whatever. Now he's going to go to another team. Is this what D'Antoni is? Is he just going to be a a vagabond hired gun kind of coach? I mean, it kind of feels a little weird considering the fact that he was with the Suns for so long. He failed with the Lakers. He failed with the Knicks. He had some success with the Rockets, and now he's just floating around in the market again looking for another job.
Yeah, I mean, I think he should be one of the most hotly pursued coaches on the market. I just don't know for this Sixers team, again, if he makes sense. But, Caitlin Cooper of Indy Cornrows had a great piece recently about how he would fit in it with the Pacers. And there's a lot of interesting stuff to unlock there, especially, could he turn Victor Oladipo into a mini James Harden, that kind of thing? Could he get more out of Miles Turner, Sabonis, et cetera? That's a potentially interesting fit. I think the problem for him is that he's probably viewed more as a win-now coach. So some of these teams like New Orleans, Chicago, that are in the early stages of a rebuild might not see a great fit there. But, again, if the Sixers are serious about moving on for Joel Embiid, or if they're at least considering it, I could see D'Antoni and Ben Simmons. If you surround Ben Simmons with 4 shooters, that could actually be really interesting. He could basically be a 6'10" version of Steve Nash, Steve Nash has even come out and said, during his time with D'Antoni, I probably should have shot a lot more than I did. I was going as my role as traditional point guard, and so I was trying to feed everyone else. And I think Ben Simmons falls into that trap a lot too. But if Ben Simmons is the centerpiece of the Sixers, if Joel Embiid is no longer there, they trade him for whatever, and that you're building around Ben Simmons, you surround him with shooters, you could easily see Ben Simmons averaging a triple-double in a D'Antoni system.
Yeah, you mentioned Indiana. I'm still wondering why they're interviewing Mike Brown. That's another retread guy. That's another thing. Real quick, Brian. What is up with all the retreads? I thought they were supposed to be about giving new people opportunities. It's 2020. We gotta get rid of the old guard, right? We gotta move on to be more evolved and modern and everything. And I'm not seeing a ton of interviews for guys like Sam Cassell or Adrian Griffin or any of these assistants. Every name I'm seeing is a former head coach who's had 2-3 different jobs.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point because, you look at the past 5 years, and I don't want to say this, talent was obviously a big part of it, but the past 5 years all had first-time head coaches win the championship. Steve Kerr in 2015, 2017, 2018, Ty Lue 2016, Nick Nurse 2019. So, part of it, you want to look at a guy like Mike Budenholzer with the Bucks, who has been a great regular season coach and has run into the same issues over and over again in the playoffs. And Matt Moore of the Action Network had a good piece about that, where he's basically saying he's coming from this Greg Popovich coaching tree where you just kind of trust your system and you aren't as willing to make adjustments. Whereas a guy like Nick Nurse is breaking out things like a box and one. He's a super creative coach. So, yeah, it's a fair question. Should you be giving it, rather than going to these retreads? Jeff Van Gundy is also mentioned for the Houston job.
Stan Van Gundy, too. He's mentioned for every job.
Yeah, rather than go there, Mike Malone is advocating for Wes Unseld Jr., one of his assistants, to get interviews. So, would you be better off with a first-time coach who isn't necessarily married to a system, is willing to be more adaptable, especially for a rebuilding team? Again, the Chicago, New Orleans, absolutely. I think that is where they should be looking rather than go with a guy who's, had a lot of success but hasn't gotten his team past the second round or, past the conference finals ever.
By the way, people forget that Greg Popovich had no head coaching experience. Either he walked down from the GM's room to the head coaching job and became a Hall of Fame coach. So it's not like even the famous Greg Popovich had this great resume of coaching experience before he got in San Antonio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just, again, I don't want to say that is why Mike Budenholzer struggles because he had such a great regular season, but the fact that, again, it's talent is a huge part of it too. Steve Kerr had Steph Curry, Ty Lue had LeBron James, Nick Nurse had Kawhi Leonard. So I'm not saying these guys are the number one reason that their teams won a title, but I think when you see people like Spo, like Brad Stevens, like Nick Nurse, who are much more willing to adapt on the fly, be creative during the regular season, and then that carries over to the playoffs where I mean, that's what the playoffs are, right? Teams have so much time to scout you. They know your strengths and weaknesses like the back of their hand. They know how you are going to run your offense, run your defense. So they're going to take away your number one option. You got to figure out, what is my counterpunch? And it's a game of chess. And if you don't spend time during the regular season perfecting those counter moves, then you get to the playoffs and you're like, okay, well, what now? But these coaches are all great during the regular season, knowing we need to prepare for this strategy, this scenario, this strategy. And then when it happens in the playoffs, they're more willing to adapt on the fly. So I think, if whichever team is hiring a head coach this offseason, whether it's a team like the Sixers that wants to win now, or Chicago or New Orleans that knows they're probably a year or two away from genuinely contending for anything, I think that's one of the biggest questions I'm asking is, okay, like how do you value the regular season? Is it all just about wins and losses and you're going to stick to your system and just perfect that? Or are you going to experiment?
He's Bryan Toporek. Follow him on Twitter at @BToporek. Check out the NBA podcast. He's the co-host. And as all guests, he appeared today on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Bryan, always appreciate the time and the conversation.
Absolutely. Happy to come on anytime.